Ukraine is isolating Crimea and disrupting the occupiers' logistics at the front for a reason. Foreign policy reports that the Ukrainian campaign to destroy Russian military logistics in occupied Crimea and in the south of mainland Ukraine is systematically creating conditions for a future Ukrainian counteroffensive against Russian forces deprived of necessary resources. By the way, this is what I told you about in my earlier videos. The armed forces of Ukraine have chosen the tactic of not engaging the Russians head-on, but instead destroying the occupiers' logistics so that they are forced to flee without the possibility of support from the rear. And the strikes on Russian logistics have already produced results. The Russian Federation's offensive has slowed down 16-fold over the past year. In the last month, the occupiers have captured only 30 square kilometers in Ukraine. This is reported by the Institute for the Study of War. And this is despite all of Vladimir Putin's assurances that the Russian army is advancing along the entire front line. As he put it, the guys keep pounding away every day. In addition, for 4 years, Vladimir Putin was largely able to somehow shield Russians from the economic consequences of the war against Ukraine. But now this has changed, and Russians are feeling the war themselves. And importantly, in Europe, they sensed an opportunity in all this. The war in Ukraine has entered a decisive phase, and this moment should be used by Kiev's allies. This was a statement by the German defense minister Boris Pistorius. According to him, Ukraine needs money to produce weapons and to be able to defend itself from Russia, and Europe has this money. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss these topics together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and write any comment below this video. That was really just a preamble. Now let's get to the point. So today, an interesting article by foreign policy journalist Paul Hakanos was published. He writes that the Ukrainian campaign to destroy Russian military logistics in occupied Crimea and in the south of mainland Ukraine is consistently creating conditions for a future Ukrainian counteroffensive against Russian troops deprived of necessary resources. The author describes the campaign of Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian logistics routes in the occupied territories that began in April. From hunting fuel trucks on the roads to destroying ferries at the Kerch crossing. The article states that the consequences of such a campaign go far beyond mere inconvenience for the civilian population. Ukrainian strikes have already led to shortages of fuel and ammunition in the occupied territories of Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. Next, I will quote foreign policy. Ukraine's halt of fuel supplies to the southern front is paralyzing Russian military logistics and isolating Russian forces. This makes it difficult to rotate troops, evacuate the wounded, and supply weapons. Back in May, the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine announced a strategy of logistical isolation aimed at turning Crimea into an island isolated from mainland Russia. Minister of Defense of Ukraine Mikhail Fedorov. He stated that the goal is to cut the peninsula off from Russian supply routes and destroy critical infrastructure so that the Russian occupation gradually declines. George Barros, an analyst at the Institute for the Study of War, believes that Ukraine is currently creating the most favorable conditions for future offensive actions. As he stated, quote, Ukraine is shaping the battlefield right now. According to the expert, Ukrainian forces are gradually making the Russian defense more vulnerable, and the counteroffensive itself can only begin after the enemy has been worn down over time, which is exactly what the Ukrainian armed forces are doing now. In addition, he noted that the Ukrainian Defense Forces campaign has not only a military effect but also a political one. It is stated that the Kremlin is already sending larger contingents of FSB personnel to Crimea. Well, probably to deal with future public discontent. And so, according to the expert, Russia is also forced to transfer additional troops and air defense systems to the peninsula to protect supply routes. Well, by creating a threat to Crimea, Ukraine not only complicates the supply of Russian troops along the entire southern front, but also demonstrates to Russian society that the occupation of the peninsula did not provide the security that the Kremlin promised after its capture in 2014. And now the strikes on logistics are already producing results. The Institute for the Study of War has calculated that in June, Russian troops captured or penetrated into Ukrainian territory covering about 30 square kilometers. That is, the average pace of the Russian army's advance in Ukraine is about 1 square kilometer per day. That's across the entire front line, 1 square kilometer per day. For comparison, analysts provided figures for June 2025. At that time, the Russian army captured 481 square kilometers, advancing an average of 16 square kilometers per day. Thus, the speed of the Russian advance has decreased by about 16 times over the year. The Institute for the Study of War notes that Russian territorial gains have been mostly slow and gradual for more than a year now. Even the faster pace of Russia's advance in 2025 was described by analysts as essentially a step-by-step offensive. And as the Institute emphasized, the speed of the Russian army's advance has been steadily decreasing since November 2025. The occupiers were also unable to regain control of territories after successful Ukrainian counterattacks in the Kupiansk and Oleksandrivka directions at the end of 2025 and in the spring of 2026. Although, let me remind you, Vladimir Putin managed to publicly declare these territories captured several times. They were recaptured, and the Russians never seized them again. And analysts have noted that the main territorial gains of the Russian troops are still concentrated in the area of Kostiantynivka in the Donetsk region, which is the main focus of the Russian Federation's efforts. However, even there, the Russians have only managed to achieve slow tactical advances in the urban area, and that has come at the cost of very significant losses. Comparing the first half of 2026 with the same period in 2025, experts also noted a significant slowdown in the Russian offensive. According to them, in the first 6 months of 2025, Russian forces captured 2,190 square kilometers. During the same period in 2026, they advanced or penetrated only 622.5 square kilometers. So, in 2026, the Russian army gained only 28.5% of the area it had captured before, or occupied during the first 6 months of the previous year. And now Vladimir Putin, in the last 2 weeks alone, I don't know, maybe 10 times already, has assured Russians that the Russian Federation's army is advancing on all fronts. As he said, there is not a single section of the front where the armed forces of the Russian Federation are not advancing. As he stated a week ago, the guys are pounding every day, advancing every single day, and so on. In general, Putin is doing everything he can to flood Russian society with the message that, yes, listen, drones are flying over your heads, oil refineries are exploding, there's no gasoline, and you're sitting in lines at gas stations for days. Yes, there are problems, but at least our guys are pounding every day at the front. So from this, the average Russian is supposed to understand that, well, yes, these are problems in my life, but at least the army is advancing. But, as noted in the report by the Institute for the Study of War, despite minor territorial gains, the Russian army is suffering significant losses in manpower and equipment. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine in June 2026, Russian troop losses amounted to almost 40,000 killed and wounded. That means for every captured or infiltrated square kilometer, there were about 1,298 Russian casualties. Think about it again, nearly 1,300 people killed and wounded just to capture 1 square kilometer. Again, for comparison, just to understand how hard the guys at the front are fighting. In June 2025, the Russian Federation lost about 32,680 servicemen. That amounted to about 68 losses for every square kilometer captured. That is, over the year, the number of Russian losses per unit of captured territory increased almost 20 times. This is a huge achievement of our drone forces, so drones on the front line really do deliver results. 20 times more losses per unit of captured territory. And in the end, analysts emphasize that significant equipment losses against the backdrop of slow offensive progress indicate the effectiveness of Ukrainian strikes on Russian military targets, logistics, and command posts in the rear. At the same time, according to deep state analysts, a turning point is approaching in the war in Ukraine, and the development of events will depend on the actions of the Ukrainian command. According to them, quote, "If in May we took 2 steps forward, then in June we already took 1 step forward and 1 step back." They added that the successes of Ukraine's defense forces are still almost impossible to demonstrate in terms of territory. But, as I already said, the armed forces of Ukraine don't seem to have the goal of liberating territory right now. That is, not to show results simply by square kilometers. For now, it's necessary to destroy the Russians' logistics. Deep State also stated that Ukraine is gradually, unfortunately, losing Konstantinovka. According to analysts, the front line in the Russian-Ukrainian war has mostly stabilized on a strategic level, but there are still problematic areas, and among them is Konstantinovka. And also, the Russians are advancing in the area of Hulyapol, Lyman, and in the Sloviansk direction. And against this backdrop, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius stated that the war in Ukraine has entered a decisive phase, and this moment should be used by Kyiv's allies. According to him, Ukraine needs money to produce weapons, and to have the ability to defend itself from Russia. And Europe, he says, has that kind of money. He considers it their shared responsibility not to weaken efforts in this direction. In particular, it is about the fact that at the NATO summit in Ankara, which will take place on July 7 and 8, they plan to create a support fund for Ukraine in the amount of 40 billion euros, of which 12 billion should be provided specifically by Germany. Remember, in one of the previous episodes we calculated that if this fund is created, Ukraine's military budget will start to exceed the military budget of the Russian Federation this year. So, in an interview with Der Spiegel, Pistorius stated that today's Bundeswehr, which is the armed forces of Germany, has become more capable of waging war than it was in 2022, and this is also thanks to Ukraine. Here is his quote. Of course, there are still gaps. Much of what has been ordered is not yet in the warehouses. But today we are in a completely different position than we were 3 years ago. Our personnel is growing. We are learning in a completely different way. We are building much more than in previous years, and we are mastering new capabilities, above all drones, using everything we are learning from Ukraine's experience. And against this backdrop, Politico writes today that for 4 years, Vladimir Putin has largely managed to shield himself. Russians from the economic consequences of the war against Ukraine, but now that has changed. As Politico writes, Ukrainian missile and drone strikes on key energy infrastructure in recent weeks have turned the war from a relatively minor irritant that most Russians could ignore into an immediate and increasingly acute fuel crisis. At the same time, the scale of the damage is being carefully concealed. Russia has added domestic fuel prices to the list of economic data it no longer publishes. However, Russians are witnessing the worsening situation with their own eyes. Social media is filled with videos showing drivers attacking each other simply because of gasoline, or causing riots in lines of cars waiting for fuel. I won't show these videos on YouTube, but just out of curiosity, try Googling or searching in Telegram channels where Russian men and women actually get into real fights. They fight each other, pull each other's hair, and hit cars just to get fuel and fill up a canister. Actually, no, filling up a canister isn't allowed. To fill up the car with 20 liters of gasoline, they're getting into fistfights at gas stations over 20 liters of gasoline. It's especially amusing to watch how Russian women, I'm not going to hold back, this isn't sexism because it refers to Russians, just attack cars. And they hit these cars demanding to be let through first. And again, let me repeat, when I say Russian woman, it's not sexism because it refers to Russians. I would never address other women like that. So, Ukraine is now deliberately attacking oil refining units that Russia cannot repair or replace on its own. This means that a quick solution to the fuel shortage problem is not expected. And now I'll quote a politician. The amount of gasoline available in Russia right now, is determined by the race between Ukrainian drones and Russian repair crews. If the frequency of Ukrainian attacks remains the same and the damage from each attack increases, the advantage will shift to Kyiv. That's exactly what we're seeing right now. It's important to note that for now, the Russians don't realize this. The thing is, fuel prices usually have a big, I would even say huge, impact on overall inflation. And the Central Bank of Russia has warned that the recent price spike is likely to have more long-term consequences than it did in the past. At the same time, military and secret expenditures of the Russian Federation now make up almost half of the total government spending. Liquid assets in the National Wealth Fund, which was originally created to cushion economic fluctuations in oil prices, have meanwhile decreased, probably from 7% of GDP at the beginning of 2022 to just about 1.5% of GDP as of April this year. That means Vladimir Putin's war chest fund is also almost depleted. So, as they say, the fuel shortage is being felt not only by Putin, and the consequences of this will be felt for a very long time. Meanwhile, the armed forces of Ukraine will continue to strike Russia. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone. To be continued.